misery to Job's misery?
Yeah.
Sure.
All right, let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious Lord, Heavenly Father, as we continue to go through the life that you have called us to live, help us to know that you have apportioned times for all things, times for successes, times for pleasantness, times for suffering and pain. And help us to commend ourselves in all such times unto your care. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so we are hoping to finish up with Job's speeches today. We will read 28 through up to the time when Elihu starts to speak, so 28 up through 31. It's a lot of language, but they're just only a few basic points that Job is making through all of this. Before we dive in, so what do you think of Job's final appeal, his summary defense, and the way he kicks this all off with his pontificating on the nature and location of wisdom?
Well, he said that all wisdom comes from God, really.
Right.
It wasn't from ourselves or anybody else.
Yeah, he very directly talks. I mean, he goes into an extended talk about mining, which for archaeologists is also interesting for the ways it illuminates what mining must have been like back in Job's day. But his point is, you can dig into the earth for all these gems, but where are we supposed to get wisdom from? Only one person knows where to find wisdom, and of course, like you said, Larry, that's God. On that connection about wisdom, does that mean, therefore, that wisdom is it's impossible for human beings to ever be wise or to get wisdom in any form?
No.
No, why not? What Job even indicates.
God gives you a certain amount.
Right.
And some people use more and some less.
Right. Yeah, God knows where wisdom is. He alone possesses it, but he does, in fact, make wisdom known to us. Very interestingly, what does Job say about what God shows, kind of wisdom God shows us? Do you remember? It's in verse 28 if you want to get a reminder of chapter 28.
He says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Right. The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding. So, well, first of all, that's a really common phrase. In the scriptures, I should say. It is a theme throughout the Old Testament. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fear God if you want to be wise, on and on. What do you make of all of that statement? Just breaking it down. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
If you don't fear the Lord, you never will have true wisdom.
And why is that?
Because God blesses those that fear him. And in response, he does give a certain amount of wisdom.
Okay, so let's ask a couple of basic questions just to draw out what you're saying here. So what are we even talking about? What is wisdom in the first place? What does that mean to have wisdom or to be wise?
Anything that's related to fearing God is wisdom.
Okay, sure. If you don't fear God, you don't have wisdom. So how would you tell the difference between somebody who claims to fear God and doesn't, and somebody who genuinely fears God? What about the way that they live can you tell that's wisdom versus that guy's a fool?
Yeah.
Stay away from sin.
Actions.
Okay, on the big hint, their actions. They stay away from sin, or as Job puts it, they turn away from evil. So in a certain sense, just following what God says and trusting that what he knows what he's talking about in a very real sense is a big part of what it means to be wise, right? I guess if you wanted to put it in another way, you might say wisdom is a right perception about how the world works and how to move forward well in life in this world. And you get, by the way, there's a big difference between knowing stuff and wisdom in that sense, right?
True.
Have any of you met really smart people who are absolute idiots?
No horse sense.
You're probably looking at one. I'm not going to say I'm really smart, but I don't pretend to be a particularly wise person. I know a lot of people who are very well educated and have really good processing power up here, and yet seem to not understand some very basic things about what is good in life, right? So it's not just knowing facts or understanding things about the world. Wisdom is this much deeper sense of truly being able to navigate through this world well, in a good direction, towards a purposeful, meaningful end. And like you said, you can tell a person's wise by what they do. If they're acting in ways that are going to be destructive, that are going to be, frankly, just against God, then you know they're acting like a fool, because they are pushing against the very foundation of reality and the one who dictates what the course of reality is and what end we're meant for. I think it's not unjust to say that in every day and age, the world is probably more full of fools than of wise people. For a very simple reason. In every day and age, more people do not fear God than do actually fear God. I know in our own day and age, it's probably very out on the sleeve in a lot of ways that people can look at a huge swaths of what's going on and say, it's not driven by wisdom, that's for sure. That it's driven more by self-indulgence, ideas about what we think would make a successful life. In ways that we think will actually perpetuate our lives, secure our futures, but in the long run end up to, well, turn to ash in our mouths and will ultimately prove our ruin. There's certain things I'm thinking about. For instance, and I don't think it's unsafe to say this in the crowd, this particular crowd, just the fact that we can't even seem to understand what the difference between a boy and a girl is anymore. How little wisdom do you need to not be able to do that? But kind of like I mentioned up there at the end of service today, this is very much founded in not having any idea who God is or caring that much about who God is. If you have absolutely no fear of God, you don't care if he's triune or not. It's kind of the same perspective you may have heard frequently. I know I hear it a lot, that it doesn't matter what you believe, what matters is what you do. As long as you are a good person, that is what's important. The basic gist of the idea is God doesn't care about what you think about him. What God cares about is what kind of person you are. Now, on the face of it, that might sound like there's a certain kind of sense to it, right? Because we would rather live next to decent people rather than non-decent people, and we do know people who claim to believe a lot of correct things about God who aren't particularly decent people, right? So which is more important, being decent or having correct beliefs?
Correct beliefs.
Correct beliefs are the most important thing, for all kinds of different reasons, not the least of which is you cannot truly understand what it means to act decently if you have no idea about who God is, who calls you to act in certain ways. If you have no idea who God is, and you don't even think it matters, well then why should anything matter about what is going to be your basis for what constitutes a good and worthwhile life? If you have already decided that it's okay for you to redefine the author, the perfecter, and the completer of human destiny, then you're literally just making up human destiny as you go. However it looks to you, however it looks to others, you are acting like a fool, a man without a map, adrift in the sea. And that's just where we are in so many respects these days. But I think it's also worth emphasizing that is always where we are most of the time, most of human history. If there's one big difference between the way it comes out today and the way it came out yesteryear, is that, I suppose you might say, the broader culture has been living on the fumes of those who feared God for a long time. That is to say, all true wisdom in the world, all true wisdom that we find in society in a broader sense, does come from some kind of fear of God, right? there have always been a large swath of people who do not fear God particularly greatly. And yet, it seems to us that once upon a time, people acted more wisely than they do now. I assume most of you think that people tended to act wiser in your youth than young people do today. Most of you are nodding like it doesn't even, not a competition. What's that?
I believe it.
And probably one of the reasons for that is because in your day and age, whether there were more or fewer people who actually feared God, who can say? But at the very least, there was a more obvious, you might say, drift downward from the people who feared God and their views about what constitutes a good and worthwhile life than there are now. There was more in the tank, so to speak, or more of those fumes in the bottle that allowed the culture as a whole to at least move in relatively a right direction. As those fumes are now fading from the bottle, and there is less and less fear of God to, so to speak, refresh the air of the culture with the wisdom of God, it's more and more noticeable that those fumes are quickly deteriorating and evaporating, and we are quickly heading into a world completely without fear of God in the way that it seems to be managed. And, well, the consequences are pretty plain for us to see. So, anyway, getting back to the point here. Wisdom, being the sense of what the world is and how to move forward well in it, is very much grounded, of course, on knowing God. But interestingly, why does it always phrase it, do you think, in the Old Testament, not as the knowledge of God is the beginning of wisdom, not even faith in God is the beginning of wisdom, not love of God is the beginning of wisdom. Strangely enough, the Old Testament always seems to latch on to this particular word, fear. Why fear? That's not something we like to talk about too often when we're talking about, well, how often do you talk about God as someone you should be scared of? Is that what it means? I guess.
No, it doesn't mean you should be afraid of God.
Well, what does it mean?
It means that we should act accordingly to His will.
But, okay, so why not put it, the obedience of God is the beginning of wisdom? Why is fear the word it keeps using over and over again? Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Psalms, Job, many of the prophets. Why fear? And in fact, you might remember from Small Catechism, when we're talking about the first commandment, do you remember what the explanation of the first commandment is?
Fear, love, and trust in God above all things.
Right. There's love and trust in there, but what's the first one?
Fear.
What do we mean, or what does the scripture mean beyond simple obedience? Or does it mean anything beyond simple obedience?
Well, fear is something most everybody understands.
It is. It is.
So it gets your attention, I guess.
So in a certain sense, there is this element of I'm worry, W-A-R-Y, of God. Here's one way I always think is, I always put it to confirmands because I find this helpful. My dad was a very, very strict father. He was. I don't walk in his footsteps quite so much, not because I don't respect what he did, it's just I have the personality more of my mother in the way I deal with my kids. Maybe I'll be wrong in the long run. But my dad was a very strict guy. If he said, you are going to do this, for instance, you better be home by 8 o'clock after this game ends. You know what we never did?
Never got
home
at
after.
8:01.
We never got home at 8:01. And you know why?
You would have got
Fear.
the bell.
The fear of my father was the beginning of, well, avoiding really unpleasant things. And the fear of my father kept us in line. And in a point of fact, while I might not have said the fear of my father was the beginning of my wisdom in the family, in a very real sense, you know what helped me become the sort of person I am today? My fear of my Father.
Yeah.
Because my Father was absolutely serious. If you do this, then I will do this. And you won't like what I'm about to do.
God says the same thing.
Exactly. God acts very much like a father. It's not by accident that Ephesians says that from him all we call all earthly fathers what they are. God is serious about what he says, and he is firm. And we should have the healthy respect for who he is on the one hand, as someone higher than us, and likewise a healthy respect, a healthy enough respect of what he can and will do if and when we defy him. That is, we fear, we are afraid of the consequences of disobeying him, that we start to, through that fear, learn obedience, and therefore start to walk in his ways. This is what Luther, again, commenting on the close of the commandments, says when he's citing that portion in the Exodus 20 where God says, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. What does this mean? God threatens to punish all who break these commandments. Therefore, we should fear his wrath and not do anything against them. I learned to not tell lies because my father punished me very effectively when I was caught in a lie. I learned not to use four-letter words because it wasn't just my dad. My mom washed my mouth out with soap frequently, and I was scared to death of having my mouth washed out with soap.
I know what you mean.
You become quite a connoisseur of soap, as the Christmas story puts it. Dawn was the worst.
Also, I had to go cut my own switch. If I didn't get it big enough on it, I had to go back.
Oh. See, what was funny is my mom actually usually did the punishing, but we were scared of my dad. My mom had a big metal spatula she used to use on our backsides. My dad, he just would use a voice and a look. He had a belt, and I think I remember him using it once on me. I remember dozens of times my mom used the spatula on me. I don't know why, but the fear of, I was more afraid of my dad, and it kept me in line, and that fear inculcated habits and a way of seeing the world that just has been remarkably helpful.
We need to go back to love.
Yeah, we
did.
Some of that old
They
time.
won't let you.
Got to put the fear of God in them, is how they used to put it, right? They weren't joking around, and it was, and I agree with you in that I don't think we do ourselves any favor when we remove fear as an actual path to wisdom.
Spare the rod and spoil the child.
Ain't it the truth? So yeah, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Not because God is this horrible tyrant who's standing over us looking for a reason to put down the hammer on us, but because God, who is the only one who knows what is good for us, when he specifies these things, is very serious that we walk in the ways he lays out. And he means to enforce the ways he knows are best for us, with the rod, if necessary. And so, what is the beginning of wisdom? Fearing God's wrath and not doing anything against him. That is not, notice here Job doesn't say fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. He says that it is wisdom, but in other places it talks about being the beginning. And I think beginning is a good way to put it. Because, like with my dad, it's not as though if I just would have stayed only scared of him, I would have gone anywhere except I'm just scared of being punished, right? Rather, by fearing him and starting to walk in the ways he set out for me because partly of my fear for him, what else did I learn to do? I learned to, for one thing, build the habits he was trying to do, just as a matter of course, because I had to do it so often, you just didn't even think of doing it any other way after a while. And second of all, you start to learn to actually genuinely appreciate it. So fear includes, yes, some actual being scared of, but especially a healthy respect for, that when you are motivated by that scaredness and that respect for, as you walk in that way, you start to understand, or at least in some dim way, glimpse the goodness of what that fear is trying to teach you. And that is a good thing. I know you guys grew up with that kind of probably in your households, so this is not exactly a hard sell to you guys.
I think being brought up that way, for me, I appreciate it now. It led me, I didn't get into, mischief, but no big trouble.
Right.
So, yeah, it leads you down the right path.
It certainly can. It certainly can. All right. So anyway, there's like you were saying, Job says God is the source of wisdom, and he communicates it to us. And what does he teach us? Fear me. Listen to what I say. Turn from what I call evil. And that will bring you wisdom. All right. So let's set that aside. We could go on with that for a good long while. But anything else that stick out to you guys about Job's whole summary defense thing?
Are we going all the way through chapter 31? And that?
Yeah, anywhere in 28 through 31 up to 32. Just anything that stuck out to you that you want to talk about, let's do that.
It's not fresh in my mind what happens after chapter 31, because I haven't read this lately.
Right. We haven't read that part yet.
Well, I understand
Yeah.
that, but is this the last time that Job actually addresses the situation?
This is the last time Job makes any real debate about this topic. The next time Job speaks will be in response to God saying, now I'm going to question you, and you answer me. And Job basically says, I'm sorry, I'll shut up now.
Well, in chapter 29, he basically spends that whole time saying that he didn't really deserve this, because he was almost a perfect guy. And, he didn't really say a whole lot, in my opinion, in chapter 30. Truthfully, he just kind of pointed out how everybody turned on him and then started mocking him.
Sure.
But then in 31, he kind of came back with his final plea for justice. So it seems like to me there's 9 chapters left for Job just to sit waiting for something to happen.
Right. No, and what happens immediately is this fourth guy that we hadn't heard about at all until this point comes on the scene and starts trying to do what Job's 3 friends had up to now failed to do, which is show Job the error of his ways. And then, well, we'll get to Elihu probably next week. It's interesting in its own regard in the way that he gets no introduction and nobody even mentions Elihu. It's as though from the standpoint of every other character in the book, whether Job, his 3 friends, or God himself, Elihu may as well not have even spoken because nobody pays any attention to what Elihu said. So that'll be a good discussion on its own. But yeah, what happens after this is Job falls silent after 31. Elihu goes on his 3-chapter rant against Job, and then God just comes in and basically brings everything to its end in a very interesting way, which of course we'll get to very soon, hopefully not tonight, but and that will be the end of the book of Job.
Okay.
Yeah.
One thing I caught reading was that Job kind of railed against the fact that God had blessed him so, and through that blessing he was blessing a lot of other people under him.
Right.
And that he couldn't understand why God was in a sense punishing them too, because he didn't have the stuff to give them anymore.
Right. There's a lot of. It's a very interesting way that Job moves on from that statement, especially of the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding. Because basically what happens in 29 and after his complaints in 30 and then back in 31 is to say, and I took that seriously. God said, this is wisdom. Fear me, turn from evil. And with my whole heart, I feared God and turned from evil. And I was Elihu, you accused me earlier of oppressing the poor, destroying the widow, just being a horrible person to the fatherless. But what actually happened is that everywhere I went, I used everything God gave me, not for my own aggrandizement, but to bring blessings to other people. If there was somebody in misery, I was the first one there offering a helping hand. If there was somebody suffering injustice, I was pleading their case. I fear God, and I tried very hard to turn from evil. So yeah, like you're absolutely right in the sense of what he's saying here. That he goes on to say, like in all kinds of places. For instance, we'll just pick one randomly here. When I went out to the gate of the city, when I prepared my seat in the square, this is verse 7, young men saw me and withdrew, the aged rose and stood. Princes refrained from talking and laid their hand on their mouth. The voice of the nobles hushed, and their tongues stuck to the roof of their mouth. You could almost get the sense at this point that Job was saying, everybody respected me so much and it was great. But that's not what he's saying, because then he goes on. When the ear heard, it called me blessed, and when the eye saw it, approved, because I delivered the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to help him. The blessing of him who was about to perish came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. Over and over again, he's simply saying, I have done everything I can in my power, which was considerable, because God blessed me so richly. I bent all of those blessings to serving the people around me. So yeah, exactly. There's one verse in particular I wanted to, and then in fact he even goes in verse 18 to almost echoing the voice of Job's friends, almost as though he's saying, I once thought as you guys did, that when you fear God and turn from evil and do what God himself has told you is wise, that God will bless you and things will go well. Or what does he say in 18? Then I thought, I shall die in my nest, and I shall multiply my days as the sand. My roots spread out to the waters with all the dew on my branches, my glory fresh with me, and on, as basically saying, because I was doing everything in my power to fear God and walk in his ways and turn from evil, I just assumed God would be a hedge around me, more or less, and things would be okay. But of course, then chapter 30 begins, but that is not how things actually panned out. Now, even the people who are the scum of the earth, who everybody doesn't want around them, laugh at me as though I'm underneath them. So it's almost this basically long, complicated way of saying the fear of the Lord is wisdom. God alone knows this. This is what he has revealed, and I have walked, and I took him seriously. I feared God. I walked in his ways. I turned from evil. And now look, so what is going on here? Everybody now despises me. My life is coming to nothing. It's an interesting way to go about saying his case at this point. We're coming to a little bit more about 31 I want to spend some time on, just because of the way Job outlines lots of really specific kinds of things that he would be happy if God would accuse him of that, so at least he would know what was going on. But before we do that, anything else that jumps out at you? So yes, you're absolutely right there, Larry, about what Job is saying here. All right. Well, in that case, I'll only point out one more thing in chapter 30, is that after he talks about this is wisdom, to fear God, specifies basically how he has tried so hard to fear God, and then how things went south for him. He also points out in verse 31, instead of, being blessed by God, chapter 30, verse 19, God has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes. I cry to you, that is God, for help, and you do not answer me. I stand and you look at me, and you have turned cruel to me. With the might of your hand you persecute me. Basically, despite my fear of the Lord, God has still, I have a healthy respect for God, and yet God has still turned against me. He ignores my prayers, my cries for help, my pleas for some kind of understanding about what's going on. And so now here I am, left in this place where, despite all the fear of the Lord in the world, the Lord has turned against me. With that being said, let's turn to chapter 31 here just for a minute here. Because then Job, again, like you were saying there, Dennis, he lays out his final case, which is basically a big case of, I have been good. I've feared God. I've walked in the ways of wisdom. What I want to point out is how he goes through it's also a really interesting way of highlighting certain things that God expects of us. Because Job does this by saying, if I had done this sin, then by all means God would be right to do this. And if I'm guilty of it, then sure, let God do this and worse. But I haven't done that as far as I can possibly tell, so what the heck. But mainly I want to focus in on the various kinds of sins that Job says, just to get a little perspective on how Job looks at those specific sins, and in his wisdom of fearing God as being somebody who takes these things seriously, says, I would be right to be cursed in horrible ways. And then compare that to how, say, our own society views a lot of these sins these days. So let's start with chapter 31. Somebody want to read 1 through 4. And we're going to be a little more deliberate about this chapter just because it'll be interesting to point these things out.
1 through 4.
Yeah, 1 through 4.
I made a covenant with my eyes, not to look lustfully at a girl. For what is man's lot from God above, his heritage from the Almighty on high? Is it not ruin for the wicked, disaster for those who do wrong? Does he not see my ways and count my every step?
Okay. So he starts out with one sin that he, I guess hypothetically, basically is saying, could I be guilty of this, in a way of saying, no, I've promised myself, I made a covenant with my eyes not to do this. And what is that sin?
Sex, lust.
Well, especially here, lust, looking at a woman with his
Right.
eyes. And the way he puts that is, if I had done that, basically, would not calamity and ruin rightly come upon such a wicked person who would look lustfully at a virgin, at some woman not his wife? Kind of echoing, by the way, something, or I should say, not echoing because this came well after, but do you remember the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is going through a laundry list of sins that you have heard that it was said, for instance, do not murder, but I say to you. There's one after that, he says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you. Do you remember what he says after that, more or less? Yeah. Anyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Mm-hmm. And this is interesting in a lot of ways, because already sometimes people make a big deal about how Jesus strengthened the law in ways that never even occurred to the Old Testament people to think about it. That it wasn't just about what you did, but what went on in here. Mm-hmm. What does Job seem to get across? Is Job under the impression, As long as I don't actually sleep with someone, I'm fine. No, he seems to be fully aware that God requires exactly the sort of thing Jesus talks about. That even daydreaming about some other woman is a problem. And what kind of a problem does Job seem to think it is?
With his eyes.
Well, okay, it happens with his eyes. That just looking at a woman and then lusting after her, that's the way the problem occurs. But I guess a better way to ask the question, in Job's mind, how seriously would God rightly take this?
Very.
Disaster and calamity should come upon such a person. So, Job is of the opinion that even lusting after a woman, God would be perfectly right to bring calamity and disaster on such a person. Now, does that sound much like the kinds of things you hear all the time? Well, everybody does that. I mean, come on. Who can be expected to restrain that?
No.
Do you want to know a very depressing statistic? Sometime, if you're idly curious, just do a search for what the top 25 most accessed websites are on the internet over the last year. Obviously, you'll get some of the big ones. Google, I mean, everybody uses the search engine. Amazon, those kinds of things. You want to know what the top, or in the top 25, 3 positions are? I believe it's 9, 11, and 12 respectively.
Probably porn.
Porn. It has become so utterly normalized as not a problem at all, as in their minds a victimless crime. So not a crime. And yet, it is exactly the kind of thing that is tailor-made to create lustful intent towards someone who is not your spouse. The kind of thing that we write off so lightly as a culture, in our own hearts and our own minds. By the way, you want another depressing statistic? You want to know the average age of a person's first exposure to porn?
Probably 4 or 5 or 6.
Well, deliberate, I suppose you might say, exposure to porn. 4 and 5s, they might accidentally stumble across it.
12.
9.
Mm.
You want to know an even more depressing statistic? You want to know the number of men estimated based on self-reporting in surveys who regularly use pornographic websites?
Probably 50%.
Well over 70%.
Oh my God. That's good.
I could give you even more depressing statistics about this, but I think it sufficiently gets the point across. We do not take this seriously anymore.
Well, when they turn people out of prison for murder and sex crimes and just emptying the prisons, this seems like nothing, you know.
Well, granted, compared to the panoply of things that you could do to the world, this seems like relatively small potatoes.
That's what's causing it, though. I mean, it's causing it to seem like nothing.
Right, and no doubt. And this is an interesting thing, too, because this is obviously one of the big things. There are worse crimes in the world, obviously, anyone would want to agree with, than that. It's obviously a bigger problem if Dennis is going on a murdering rampage. Probably want to deal with that before I deal with those other things, because that just causes more obvious destruction in the world, right? But 2 kinds of points about that. God's law is not a comparison of sins.
No.
It is a list of things that are forbidden. It's not as though just because something causes more destruction between people, that it doesn't therefore cause more or less destruction in our relationship to God. Both cause a complete breakdown of your fear of God. Both are a complete breakdown of your trust in God and your love for God.
And you have so many people involved, not just the looker, but the person that has created that.
Oh, it's...
And on and
And the
on
victims.
And on. I mean...
It's a sickening industry in every... That we could even call it an industry as its own commentary on society. But it's sickening on all these levels. The people who engage in the acts, the people who exploit the people who engage in the acts, the people who record it and then advertise it and monetize it, and therefore teach others to look at people only as objects of satiating my appetites. And speaking of the damage that is actually done in society, it's not as though this kind of thing has no real consequences in terms of what it does to society. There's so many studies one could cite about the deleterious effects of pornography. And we're not even just talking about looking at women, which is what Job is talking about, like looking at your neighbor, for instance. Mm-hmm. But what porn itself has done to raise aggressiveness in among people who partake it, to confuse them about what is appropriate ways to treat people. I could go. I'm kind of trying to be more gentle for your own sensibilities in describing these things, but the point is, it destroys the heart and the mind of the person who uses it. It destroys their capacity to have normal and healthy relationships with the people around them and causes them to enter exploitive and damaging relations with the people they do relate with, and it destroys their own sense of self-worth and their ability to perform any meaningful labor in the world. These are just well-documented facts that it is absolutely destructive to the productivity, the self-worth, and the ability to relate in a respectful manner with other people in the people who use pornography. It's a horrible blight on our society. But we don't see it that way.
Well, they're trying to push it in the elementary schools.
Yes. I'm not going to go further into this because this is a whole this warrants its own study about what is meant by comprehensive sexual education, what its purposes and goals are, and what its assumptions are for human beings, and what is normal and healthy human behavior. We could go on for this for hours, and sometime we probably should, just because I don't know if you're even aware of the kinds of things. This is why we refuse to put our kids in the public school in Illinois. We just wouldn't do it, because they had just recently passed this kind of comprehensive sex ed for down to kindergartners.
It's ridiculous.
It is, but anyway, so we won't chase that rabbit hole too much further. But it's just to say, as you're rightly indicating, it does bring calamity down. And by the way, it does bring calamity down, just not in the way that we probably normally think of God bringing calamity down on us. It's not as though tons of people are getting struck by lightning bolts. Rather, the calamity is more the sort God allows us to drink the dregs of our drink to the bottom, so that the ruin that it naturally brings is now coming very heavily upon us. And if you think that's not the wrath of God, well, then obviously you don't fear God too much or respect what he actually says.
There's
but
also lots of, look at all the money that's accumulated by porn.
It is an industry.
It's an industry, that's exactly right.
And it is, and again, that is its own sad commentary on our society, that it is, in fact, a legal and these days even respectable profession. Anyway, let's go on to something a little less sad, but no less evil. Verse 5 through go 5 through 8. He starts off with another sin at the top and then goes down about what if that's the case, then let these bad things happen to him.
I can read again.
Sure.
You want to read, Brad?
I'll give it a shot.
Okay.
If I have walked with falsehood, and my foot has hastened to deceit, let me be weighed in a just balance, and let God know my integrity. If my step has turned aside from the way, and my heart has gone after my eyes, and if any spot has stuck to my hands, then let me sow and another eat, and let what grows for me be rooted out.
All right. So in 7, he kind of talks generally about if there's anything going wrong. But in verse 5, what specifically does he say as, if I've done this particular thing, then by all means, let everything good that was coming to me be destroyed and go to someone else? Lying. Speaking the truth is something that God commands quite explicitly. What's the 8th commandment? Do you happen to remember? I know I'm asking you to reach back into confirmation, but
Bear false witness.
right, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not live by telling lies. Why is lying such a big deal?
Because it hurts other people.
It does. It truly hurts other people. It might seem to advantage myself for a time to tell something that will get me out of trouble. Another good lesson I learned from my dad is you might tell a lie today to get out of trouble today, but when he finds out about it a week from now, oh boy, you should have just taken the first whooping. But why it hurts other people. It especially when you're telling malicious kinds of lies. Quite obviously. Again, low-hanging fruit in our own situation. Every political party seems like it's incapable of doing anything but trying to mischaracterize everybody else who's not 100% on their side. It doesn't matter if we're talking Republican, Democrat, Independent, whatever. It seems like the only thing we know how to do, and not even politics, but just in our day-to-day life when we're talking about these high-strung issues, is to mischaracterize everybody else in the worst light possible. And that doesn't do anyone any favors. For a lot of different reasons. On the one hand, it doesn't actually help us come to the truth of a matter, and so maybe move forward in a helpful way. But even worse, it causes us to write off and out of hand people who God himself has created, who God himself has in fact set on this earth for all kinds of purposes. And it disrupts their ability to live the life that God calls them to live. It's a problem. And then there's a whole other layer of this. How can you ever really live well with someone you cannot trust?
No.
It
Or
hurts the
fact.
person. It hurts the person that's telling a lie because he's destroyed his.
Yeah.
Reputation.
You burn those bridges, and it is not easy to get people's confidence back. Human relationships of every kind, whether husband and wife, whether son to parents, whether, does not matter what kind of human relationship you are dealing with, you cannot build it on lies. As soon as lies get injected to them and get brought to light, it destroys trust. And if trust is not there, it is almost impossible to carry on with one another because you don't know you can trust the other person anymore. Again, extremely destructive. And again, what does Job overtly says? If that's been the case, if I've been dishonest, then by all means, let the crops that I sow be destroyed or given to someone else, because it is that serious. Again, our culture has very much decided that we can play very fast and loose with our words. As long as we can get whatever short-term goals we're wanting, that's the important part. Even if the goals we're aiming for are noble, if you can't get there by speaking the truth, then it's not a goal worth pursuing. And you will have gotten to the goal and destroyed everything that would allow you to live together to continue in that goal. It's just not good to lie. 9 through 12.
If my heart has been enticed towards a woman, and I have lain in wait at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow on her. For that would be a heinous crime, there would be an iniquity to be punished by the judges. For that would be a fire that consumes as far as Abaddon, and it would burn to the root of all my increase. How far, Pastor?
That's good. All right. So, if verse 1 was about lusting, what's this one about? Verse 9.
Actual sex.
Right. The actual act of adultery. If I have not been faithful to my own wife, if I have destroyed or inserted myself into my neighbor's marriage relationship, well, this is a sin that is horrible beyond all compare. The just reward with that, my own wife would just become basically a harlot, and I would be given over to the judges in judgment. Want some more depressing statistics? Do you know what the divorce rate is among Christians?
Well, it's better than 50%.
It's more than 50%. The people who claim to believe that God knows what he's talking about when he says, "You shall not commit adultery," are exactly as prone to adultery as everyone else. Now, interestingly, this is just some personal anecdotes. One thing I loved, absolutely loved about my previous call is I had maybe one case where there was a couple living together without the benefit of marriage. Only one. Almost no divorces. That community was very much grounded in that particular traditional value very strongly. My first call up in Minnesota, out of all of the marriages I did, which was about 9, I think, only one of them was the traditional, we've dated, we're not living together, we don't have kids, we're getting married. Every other case was, we've been living together, maybe have 5 kids, maybe this is my 3rd, whatever. It was night and day. I don't know that much about this community, but I already get the sense, I'm not sure about the congregation at any rate, but I know in the community, divorce is a huge, huge problem. And part of the problem, of course, is we just don't think of divorce as adultery anymore. We don't think of getting remarried as adultery anymore. I'm not saying we by every person in this room, obviously. I just mean by and large. We think more or less that marriage is something that is built on a foundation of love, in the sense of, as long as I feel strongly for you, then I'm committed to you. And if I lose that strong commitment, then you know what? There's nothing wrong with going to somebody, whether I happen to still be married to you or not, who does have that love with me. And so we have cheating on people all left and right. If they have at least a modicum of decency, if you want to call that to decency, they'll get a divorce first and then go find this other person who they love. Do you know what Christ says about that kind of thing?
Sin.
Yeah.
Shall not inherit the kingdom of God.
Well, certainly in Paul's letters, neither the idolaters nor a big list shall inherit the kingdom of God. So that alone should be a good key that maybe God doesn't approve. Going back to that same part of Matthew 5 here. This is always one that when it comes up and I preach on it, I'm a little curious what kinds of commentary I'll get back. You probably know it. I'll remind you, if I can get to it. We'll have to stop here after this and open it up to any questions you guys have. But where he says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery,' so on and so forth." We'll skip a little back, further down to chapter 5 of Matthew, verse 31. "It was also said, 'Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce.' But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality," that is, if your wife cheats on you. Except in that case, if you divorce your wife, you make her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So basically, two things there. We can get into this in more detail later, but here's the two big points that Jesus is making. When you get a divorce, you are functionally committing adultery. Because after all, what is marriage? It's a one flesh union where God joins a man and a woman together in a bond for life. If one person dies, okay, fine. You're no longer married. You can, in fact, get remarried. Paul overtly says that in 1 Corinthians. But since God has joined that together, what is divorce except to say, well, God, you were wrong. I'm going to separate what you have joined together, and I'm going to therefore make it so this woman no longer is able to live as though she is one flesh with me. I cause her to commit adultery, and therefore am myself the greater sinner, because I have put her into this position where she can only be an adulteress now. And then goes the second. So divorce itself is an act of adultery, of complete betrayal of the marital union. And remarrying after a divorce is also adultery. Why? Well, if you're one flesh union, just because I said, let's call it quits, you know what? That didn't change what God did with me and that woman. So if I decide, while I'm still married, despite my legal certificates saying I'm no longer married, in God's mind, what am I? One flesh with that person, right? And if I go ahead and I say, well, now I'm going to marry this other woman, what am I doing? I am bringing that other person into the one flesh union and disrupting it. I am literally committing adultery against my first and true spouse. This is just what Jesus says. If you marry a divorced person, you're committing adultery. It's a hard word. And of course, these days, because we care so little about what God says, we make all kinds of excuses about how God must not actually mean that. We are not, whatever we want to comment about Job's sense of his own righteousness, which there's much we could comment about. He definitely has a high opinion of himself. He has much more reason to have a higher opinion of himself than probably 99% of Christians living today have of being proud of themselves. That is to say, he at least actually seems, whether he's correct or not about how well he's done, he does actually seek to take God's word seriously. About marriage, about chastity, about honesty, we're not going into it today, about sharing your wealth with the poor, about not favoring other people, about all kinds of different things that we, in our culture today, and sadly within the church to a very remarkable degree, say, psh, it's not really a big deal. Jesus died for it, so what does it matter? It's a problem.
Did God really say not to eat?
Yeah, ain't it the truth? And that's exactly the spirit that has infected all too many of us. But we'll stop there looking at Job. I was going to leave time for questions, but we talked too long. But if you still have any, go ahead. All right, well then, we'll close it with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. I hope I remember to actually record that.